She wore her wedding dress like a condemned woman walking to the execution grounds. Serafina Vale, daughter of Chicago's most notorious traitor, stood before the mirror in pristine white silk, her eyes devoid of tears. Not because she was strong, but because she had long since run out of tears. The man waiting for her at the end of the aisle was not a prince from a fairy tale. Dorian Moretti, the coldest mafia boss in the Midwest, married her not out of love. He married her to destroy her from within. But tonight, as the candlelight falls on her skin, Dorian will discover a secret no one in this city knows. A secret that will change everything. Follow the story to the end. Like and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. The rain came down like it had a grievance with the city. It hammered the stained glass windows of St. Augustine's Cathedral in sheets so thick the afternoon light turned gray and shapeless inside, like a bruise spreading beneath skin. The pews were full, politicians in Italian suits, women in pearls who hadn't smiled genuinely in years, men whose names never appeared in newspapers but whose decisions moved courtrooms and borders. Every single one of them had come not to witness a wedding, but to observe a transaction. Serafina Vale stood in the bridal antechamber alone. The maid of honor her father had assigned, some cousin she'd spoken to 3 times in her life, had slipped out 20 minutes ago to find champagne and hadn't returned. Serafina didn't mind. She preferred the silence. Silence was something she understood. She had been raised on it. She studied herself in the full-length mirror bolted to the wall and tried to feel something specific. The dress was extraordinary, she supposed. Ivory silk with a corseted back and a train that swept 3 feet behind her like something spilled. Her dark hair had been pinned and curled by a stylist she'd never met. 2 small diamonds threaded at her temples. The makeup was flawless, the kind of flawless that covered everything. She pressed 2 fingers to her left side just beneath the ribcage. The old bruise there had mostly faded. Mostly. The door opened behind her. Vincent Vale entered without knocking. He was 61 years old and looked every year of it. A tall, gaunt man with white hair swept back from a high forehead, impeccably dressed in a charcoal morning suit. His eyes were pale gray, the kind of eyes that didn't warm under any light. He looked at his daughter in her wedding gown the way a banker looks at a ledger entry, assessing value, calculating loss. "You look adequate," he said. Serafina didn't turn from the mirror. "Thank you, Father." "We need to be in position in 4 minutes. The Moretti family doesn't wait." "I know." "You understand what today means." It wasn't a question. He never asked questions. He issued statements and waited for confirmation that his meaning had been received. Serafina had spent 25 years perfecting the art of correct confirmation. "I understand," she said. He moved to stand behind her, his reflection appearing over her shoulder in the mirror. For one moment, something shifted in his expression. Not softness, nothing close to that, but a flicker of something she couldn't name. Then it was gone. "The Morettis lost their youngest son 8 years ago because of decisions your late grandfather made, which I, unwisely, chose to involve myself in." He straightened his cuffs. "Dorian Moretti has been building toward retribution for the better part of a decade. Today, I am giving him a manageable outlet for that retribution." Serafina finally turned to look at him directly. "You're giving him me. I'm giving him a symbolic target, someone he can make uncomfortable without actual bloodshed. You are my daughter. The family name provides sufficient meaning. And if he decides symbolic isn't enough?" Vincent Vale looked at her with those pale gray eyes and said nothing for 3 full seconds. "Then you will endure it gracefully," he said, and walked out. Serafina turned back to the mirror. She exhaled once, slow and controlled, the way a person breathes when they're trying not to fall. She had endured gracefully her entire life. She was very, very good at it. The door opened again. A young assistant with a clipboard and a headset, expression professionally blank. "Miss Vale, it's time." She picked up her bouquet, white roses, which she hadn't chosen, and walked toward the door. The processional music was something classical that she didn't recognize, strings swelling through the vaulted space as Serafina moved down the aisle on her father's arm. She kept her eyes forward. She registered the pews, the candles, the faces turning toward her with the particular hungry interest of people who knew they were watching something significant. She registered the stained glass overhead, throwing fractured colors across the marble floor. She did not register any of it emotionally. She was very practiced at that, too. Then she saw Dorian Moretti. He was standing at the altar in a black suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, dark hair cut close, jaw set like he'd carved it from something hard. He was watching her approach with an expression that wasn't anger. Anger would have been easier to read. It was colder than that. It was the expression of a man who had already decided exactly what was going to happen and was simply observing the mechanics of it unfolding. He was 38. She knew that from the research she'd done on her own, quietly, in the 4 weeks between when her father had announced this arrangement and today. She'd found the publicly available information: the Moretti family, 3 generations of organized crime in Chicago and Milwaukee, legitimate business fronts in real estate and logistics, a criminal record that consisted of 2 assault charges that had both been inexplicably dismissed. A younger brother, Marco, who had died in an explosion 8 years ago at the age of 22. The explosion had been ruled a gas leak. No one who knew anything believed it was a gas leak. Serafina reached the altar. Her father released her arm, stepped back, and took his seat in the front pew with the composed satisfaction of a man who had just completed a successful negotiation. She stood beside Dorian Moretti and did not look at him. He didn't look at her either. The officiant began. The words moved over her like water over stone. Vows, promises, sacred obligations, phrases about partnership and protection and love. All of it landing in the air between them with the hollow ring of something profoundly untrue. She responded when required. He responded when required. His voice was low and very controlled, the kind of voice that understood its own power. When he placed the ring on her finger, his hand was warm and his grip was brief and impersonal, like a professional completing a task. She didn't flinch. She had been trained not to flinch. The officiant pronounced them married. Dorian Moretti looked at her for the first time, a single measured look that traveled from her face to the flowers in her hands and back, and then turned away to accept congratulations from the men waiting at the end of the first row. She stood there in her ivory silk dress with 3 feet of train and white roses she hadn't chosen, and thought, I have survived worse beginnings than this. She almost believed it. The reception was held at the Moretti family's private ballroom inside the Villano Hotel, a place so aggressively elegant it bordered on intimidating, all dark marble and candlelight and crystal that caught the glow and scattered it across the ceiling like something astronomical. 400 guests, a full orchestra, food from a catering team that Serafina had been told was normally reserved for heads of state. Everything was pristine and excessive and utterly joyless. Dorian Moretti spent the first hour of his own wedding reception conducting business. She watched him from the bridal table, which he had abandoned within 12 minutes of the formal photos, moving through the room like a system of controlled weather, pausing here for a low conversation with a man whose name she didn't know, inclining his head there to receive information from a suited figure who spoke directly into his ear and then melted back into the crowd. He was never still. He was never alone. He was never near her. Around her, conversation circulated in Italian and English, punctuated by laughter that never quite reached genuine. A woman she didn't recognize, mid-40s, diamonds at her ears, assessing eyes, leaned across the table. You're holding up remarkably well, the woman said. Thank you, Serafina said. Most girls cry, or at least look terrified. I'm not most girls. The woman studied her with an expression caught between admiration and pity. No, she agreed. I suppose you're not. She picked up her wine glass and moved away. Serafina ate approximately 7 bites of food across 2 courses and drank 1 glass of water. Around her, the evening moved with the grinding momentum of obligation. Speeches were given. One by a man she gathered was Dorian's consigliere, a compact, watchful figure named Enzo, who spoke warmly and precisely, and looked at her twice during the toast with an expression she couldn't decode. One by her father, who spoke for 3 minutes about legacy and family alliance, and never once used the word daughter. When the dancing began, Dorian finally returned to the table. He sat beside her, not close, a careful separation of several inches, and accepted a glass of whiskey from a passing server without looking at the man. You should eat more than that, he said without looking at her either, nodding toward her plate. I'm not hungry. I wasn't making a suggestion. She looked at him. He was still watching the room, that controlled weather quality undimmed by the hours and the whiskey and the accumulated weight of the evening. His profile was sharp, The line of his jaw was rigid. "Are you concerned about my health?" she asked. A pause. "I'm concerned about the optics of a wife who looks like she's starving at her own wedding reception. Eat something." She picked up her fork and ate 3 more bites. He said nothing further. After 4 minutes, he stood and walked back into the crowd. The woman beside her, a distant Moretti relative who had introduced herself as Claudia, leaned sideways and murmured, "He's always like this. Don't take it personally." "I don't," Serafina said, and it was almost entirely true. Around 10 o'clock, she excused herself to find the restroom and stood in a marble-tiled stall for several minutes with her forehead against the cool partition, breathing carefully through her nose, doing the quiet interior arithmetic she had done since childhood. You are intact. You are present. You are still here. Nothing has happened that you cannot survive. She straightened her dress, checked her makeup in the mirror, and walked back into the reception. Dorian didn't return to the bridal table for the rest of the evening. When the car arrived at 11:30 to take them from the hotel, he walked beside her across the lobby without speaking or touching her. The silence between them had a specific texture. It wasn't the silence of 2 strangers who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a man who had things to say and was choosing precisely when to say them. She found that more frightening than noise. Blackthorn Manor sat on a bluff overlooking Lake Michigan, 40 minutes north of the city, through roads that wound through dense stands of oak and pine, the lake flickering occasionally between the trees in the darkness. From the outside, it was imposing in the way that only old money combined with genuine menace could produce. 4 stories of dark stone and wrought iron, windows like watchful eyes, a gatehouse manned by 2 men with expressions professionally empty of warmth. The car rolled through and up a long gravel drive, headlights cutting through the rain that had followed them from the city. Inside, the manor was cold. Not physically. The heating worked, and the rooms were large and furnished with the kind of expensive restraint that signals serious wealth rather than ostentatious display. But there was something in the quality of the air, some absence of accumulated warmth, that told Serafina this was not a house where people had been happy for a long time, if ever. A woman named Hilda, the estate's housekeeper, stout in 60s and efficient as machinery, showed her to her room on the 3rd floor. Large windows looking toward the lake, a bed so large it seemed excessive for a single person, an attached bathroom with a soaking tub and heated floors, a closet in which, she discovered, her clothing had already been hung and organized, her personal wardrobe from the Vale family home, apparently transferred without her knowledge in the days before the wedding. She sat on the edge of the bed in her wedding dress and looked at the closet and felt the specific violation of that, the practicality of it, the assumption, the statement embedded in the gesture. This is not temporary. This is where you live now. The door opened without a knock. Dorian Moretti stood in the frame. He had removed his jacket and his tie, rolled the sleeves of his dress shirt to the forearm. He held a glass of whiskey and looked at her across the room with that same measuring expression, as though she were a problem he was in the process of calculating. "We should talk about how this works," he said. She kept her voice level. "All right." He crossed the room and sat in the chair near the window. Not on the bed, not beside her, a deliberate distance, and looked out at the rain-blurred glass for a moment before bringing his gaze back to her. "You're here because your father's debts required a settlement that money couldn't adequately address. I made a choice to take this particular form of settlement because a living reminder is more valuable than a financial one. You understand what that means. It means you want me to suffer." He considered that. "It means I want the Vale family to understand, on an ongoing basis, what their betrayal cost. Your presence here, your visibility, your access to nothing outside of what I permit, that communicates something money can't. So I'm a message. You're a consequence." She looked at him. He was watching her the way a man watches something he's trying to read in insufficient light. Intent, careful, not quite sure of what he's seeing. "The rules," he continued, voice dropping to something lower and more deliberate, "are simple. You don't leave this property without an escort I've approved. You don't communicate with your father or anyone connected to the Vale family without my knowledge. You don't discuss family business with anyone outside this house. You attend events and functions when I require your presence, and you perform the role of a Moretti wife convincingly. He paused. You breathe when I allow it. You speak when I ask, and you'll spend every day of this marriage remembering what your family did to mine. She held his gaze. She had been holding gazes like this since she was a child. Cold, commanding gazes that wanted to see her break. I already spend every day surviving, she said quietly. Something moved across his expression. It was fast and he suppressed it quickly, but she saw it, a flicker of something she couldn't name. Then the control returned, seamless and absolute. Get some sleep, he said. He stood, picked up his whiskey, and walked to the door. Paused with his hand on the frame without looking back. I'll have Hilda bring you breakfast at 7. Eat it. He left. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow landed louder than a slam. Serafina sat on the edge of the enormous bed in the silence of her new prison and pressed her fingertips to the old bruise beneath her ribs and did her arithmetic. You are intact. You are present. You are still here. She was very practiced at this. The first week at Blackthorn Manor operated according to its own brutal logic. Dorian woke before 6 and was already working when she came down at 7. In a study off the main hall, door half open, voice low and clipped on phone calls that she passed by without lingering. He ate breakfast at the kitchen table when he ate at all, reading from a laptop, or from physical files that he closed when she entered the room. Not out of carelessness, but out of policy. She was to know nothing that she didn't need to know. She was given access to the kitchen, the library on the second floor, and the covered garden terrace off the east wing. The rest of the house operated on a system of implicit boundaries she learned quickly through observation. Certain hallways, certain rooms, certain staircases simply weren't for her. The men who moved through the house with their jackets and their earpieces and their eyes that registered everything looked at her with the same blank professionalism they applied to furniture. She was a fixture, an acquisition, not a threat and not a person. She read. She walked the terrace even in rain. She ate what was prepared for her in portions that must have struck Hilda as worrying, because the housekeeper began, by the third day, leaving small additional plates, a few crackers, some fruit, sliced cheese, near wherever Serafina happened to be sitting, without comment. On the fourth morning, Dorian appeared in the library doorway while she was reading and said without preamble, "Get dressed, we have a meeting." She looked up. "What kind of meeting?" "The kind where you sit beside me and say nothing." She marked her page, closed the book, and went upstairs. The meeting was held in the manor's lower conference room, a windowless space with a long table and 8 men who stopped talking when she entered and didn't start again until Dorian sat down and made a gesture that apparently meant resume. She took the chair beside him and folded her hands on the table and looked at nothing in particular while the men talked around her in a mixture of English and Italian about supply routes and contract enforcement, and a name she heard several times that was clearly a problem, Castellano, someone who had apparently breached an arrangement and was being discussed with the particular quiet intensity that precedes serious decisions. Serafina understood, somewhere in the architecture of what was being discussed, that serious decisions meant people getting hurt, possibly killed. She sat with this knowledge and kept her face arranged correctly. At one point, a man across the table, young, broad-shouldered, a scar tracing from his left ear toward his jaw, looked at her directly for several seconds with a slow, evaluating smile that had nothing professional in it. She kept her eyes on the middle distance and her expression blank. Dorian, who had been reviewing a document when this happened, looked up from it and looked at the man. He didn't say anything. He just looked. The man's smile disappeared and he found something to study on the table in front of him, and the conversation resumed. After the meeting, in the hallway, Dorian fell into step beside her without speaking. They walked back toward the main staircase in silence. At the foot of the stairs, she stopped. "Luca," she said. He glanced at her. "What?" The man across the table, his name was Luca. A pause. "What about him?" She looked at Dorian. "I'm just noting that I have a good memory for names. For the future." Something shifted in his jaw, a tightening, brief and controlled. "You were told to say nothing." "I said nothing. I'm speaking to you now. In private." He looked at her for 3 seconds with an expression she was beginning to recognize. That calculation, that attempt to read something in insufficient light. Then he turned and walked away. She went upstairs and sat in her room for a long time with her hands in her lap, thinking about nothing in particular. Outside, the lake was gray and turbulent under a heavy sky. Wind moved through the bare branches of the trees along the bluff. She thought, he noticed I didn't flinch. She thought, good. By the end of the second week, she had mapped the house. Not physically. She already understood the physical layout well enough. She had mapped it in the other way, the way she had always mapped spaces, who moved where and when and with what purpose. Which guards rotated shifts at what hours, which doors were alarmed, and which were simply locked. Where Dorian went when he needed to be alone. A room on the fourth floor she'd identified by the pattern of footsteps overhead in the late evenings. A room no one else seemed to enter. She wasn't planning to escape. Escape required somewhere to go. She had nowhere. She was simply doing what she had always done, learning the architecture of her captivity because understanding it precisely was the only form of agency available to her. She had been doing this since she was 8 years old. She was very good at it. On the 15th night, she had the nightmare again. It wasn't always the same nightmare. Sometimes it was the basement of the Vale family estate, the cold concrete and the smell of mildew and the sound of the lock clicking. Sometimes it was younger, hazier, harder to decode, a memory compressed beyond recognition by years of trying not to think about it. But the physical sensation was always the same. Hands that she couldn't see, pressure on her chest, the inability to draw a full breath, a darkness that had weight. She woke at 2 a.m, gasping, heart slamming, and was on the bathroom floor before she fully understood she had moved. The tiles were cool under her palms. She pressed them flat against the floor and tried to breathe and told herself all the things she had always told herself. You are not there. You are somewhere else. You are intact. She was still shaking when she heard the footsteps in the hallway, fast, then stopping at her door. A pause. The pause of someone listening. Then the door opened and Dorian Moretti stood in the light from the hallway with an expression she had never seen on him before. Alert, almost alarmed, jacket missing and shirt half untucked as though he'd moved in a hurry. He scanned the room fast, then found her on the bathroom floor. He crossed to her in 3 steps and crouched down. His hand moved toward her shoulder. She recoiled so hard she hit her back against the bathtub. Don't! Her voice came out wrong, fractured, not her voice at all. Don't lock me down there again. The words came from somewhere outside her conscious control, from whatever part of her brain was still back there, still in the dark, still waiting for the click of a lock. Dorian went very still. He didn't touch her again. He crouched on the bathroom floor a foot away from her in the dimness with his forearms on his knees and looked at her, not with the calculating assessment she had grown accustomed to, not with cold indifference. He looked at her like a man who had just heard something that rearranged something fundamental. Neither of them spoke for what might have been a minute or two. Serafina's breathing slowly, effortfully leveled. She pressed the heels of her palms to her eyes and stayed very still and waited for her own body to stop betraying her. When she lowered her hands, he was still there. The floor is cold, he said finally. His voice was very quiet. I know. You should get back in bed. I will. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he stood, and for 1 second she thought he was simply going to leave, retreat back into his control and his calculations and his grievances. Instead, he walked to the linen closet near the bathroom door, pulled out a blanket, and held it out to her. She looked at it, then at him. Take it, he said, not unkindly, which surprised her more than any coldness would have. She took it. He stood in the doorway for 3 more seconds, jaw tight, looking at her with that expression she couldn't read, that expression that was new and looked almost like it hurt. Then he left. She sat on the cold bathroom floor wrapped in the blanket until the shaking stopped completely, which took another 40 minutes. In the morning, nothing was acknowledged. He ate breakfast at the kitchen table. She drank tea by the window. The house moved around them with its usual quiet machinery. But Serafina noticed, in the days that followed, that the footsteps on the floor above her room no longer sounded at 2 a.m. They sounded between midnight and 1, moving more slowly, as though the man up there was staying awake later than usual, listening to what was happening 1 floor below. She noticed. She filed it away in the place where she kept all the information that might, someday, matter. 3 weeks into the marriage, Dorian Moretti called a man named Rafe DeLuca into his study and gave him instructions. Serafina didn't know this. She was in the library when it happened, reading about the architectural history of the Great Lakes region from a book that had probably been on that shelf for 40 years untouched. She didn't know that Rafe DeLuca was the best investigator the Moretti organization employed. She didn't know what instructions he'd been given. She didn't know that the word Dorian had used in that instruction was everything. Find out everything about the Vale family estate, the basement levels, the security footage, the household staff, what they were paid to say and what they were paid to forget. She didn't know any of this. What she knew was that on that same afternoon, Dorian appeared in the library doorway for the second time. But this time he didn't say anything. He stood there for perhaps 15 seconds, looking at her reading in the gray afternoon light, and then he walked away without speaking. She turned her page. Outside, the lake churned dark and cold beneath a November sky, and somewhere in the city, a man named Rafe DeLuca was beginning to pull on a thread that was about to unravel everything. Rafe DeLuca delivered his first report on a Tuesday. It was early morning, the kind of cold that came off the lake and found every gap in every wall, and Dorian was already at his desk when Rafe knocked twice and entered without waiting for an answer, which was the standing arrangement between them, had been for 11 years. Rafe was 44 and looked older, a lean, weathered man with close-cropped silver hair, and the particular stillness of someone who had spent a long career watching things that couldn't be unseen. He set a manila folder on the desk without ceremony and took the chair across from Dorian without being invited. Dorian looked at the folder. He didn't open it. "Talk," he said. Rafe leaned forward with his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment before looking up. In 11 years, Dorian had seen Rafe DeLuca uncomfortable approximately twice. This was the third time. "The Vale estate has a sub-basement," Rafe said. "Not on any architectural filing. Not on the permits. Built sometime in the mid-90s based on the materials and the electrical work. Access is through a panel behind a false wall in the wine cellar." Dorian said nothing. "2 rooms down there. One was used for storage. Financial records, mostly. The kind you don't want audited. The other one..." Rafe stopped, looked at the folder. "The other one had a cot. Restraint hardware bolted to the wall. A chemical toilet. A ventilation shaft too small to climb through." He paused. "And a lock on the outside of the door." The room was very quiet. Outside, wind moved through the oak trees along the bluff and pressed against the study window with a low, sustained sound. "How long?" Dorian said. "Based on what I've found so far, years, multiple years. The household staff who are still reachable either don't know anything or are very committed to not knowing anything. 2 of them have non-disclosure agreements that their employment was conditional on signing. One woman, a housekeeper who left the Vale household in 2019, lives in Evanston now." Rafe paused again. "She agreed to talk when I told her I wasn't law enforcement. She cried for most of the conversation." Dorian looked at the folder on the desk, still didn't open it. "The daughter," he said. "Yes." Silence. "How old?" Rafe's jaw moved. "The sub-basement was constructed when she was approximately 8. Dorian stood up from the desk. He walked to the window and looked out at the lake. Gray and churning under a steel sky, whitecaps visible even from this distance. He stood there with his hands at his sides and his shoulders very still and breathed through his nose. "What else?" he said to the window. "There's surveillance footage. Not from inside, but the rooms weren't wired, but from the estate's external security system. Dates going back to 2009. I have someone pulling the relevant timestamps." Rafe's voice was careful, and even in the way that indicated he was working to keep it that way. "There are also medical records. Private clinic, paid cash, no insurance filings, treated for rib fractures twice, wrist fracture once, listed as accidental injuries. The attending physician retired in 2018. The physician's name. I'll have it by tomorrow." Dorian turned from the window. His face was controlled. It was the kind of control that required work. She could have seen that, Serafina, if she had been in the room, because she had become in the past 3 weeks a careful reader of the micro-expressions his control occasionally failed to fully contain. But she wasn't in the room. She was upstairs in the library, reading about lake geography. Keep going, Dorian said. Everything, every name, every date, every piece of paper with a signature on it. Rafe nodded, picked up his untouched coffee, and left. Dorian stood in the middle of his study and looked at the closed door for a long moment. Then he picked up the folder, opened it, and began to read. He said nothing to her that day. He said nothing to her the following day either, which was not unusual. There were entire days at Blackthorn Manor that passed without them exchanging more than 4 or 5 functional sentences. But something was different in the quality of his silence now, and Serafina, who was very sensitive to the quality of silences, registered it. He watched her differently. He had always watched her, assessed her, calculated her. But now when she looked up and found his eyes on her, there was something in them that wasn't cold arithmetic. It was something more unsettled, more human. It made her more careful. On the 3rd day after Rafe's first report, Dorian appeared at the library door at 10 in the morning and said, "Come with me." She put down her book. "Where?" "For a drive." She looked at him. "You don't take me for drives. I'm taking you for one now." She held his gaze for 3 seconds, the same way she'd held her father's gaze, her whole life, calculating the cost of resistance versus compliance. And then she stood and got her coat. The car was a black SUV with a driver she'd seen before. A quiet man named Curtis, who acknowledged her with a nod and nothing else. Dorian sat beside her in the back seat. They pulled through the gatehouse and onto the road heading south, toward the city. They drove for 20 minutes without speaking. She watched the trees thin and the outskirts of suburbs begin to emerge and said nothing. She had learned in 31 days at Blackthorn Manor that Dorian Moretti spoke when he was ready to speak and not before, and that pushing him produced nothing useful. She waited. "Do you know a place called Hargrove Clinic?" he said finally. She went very still. She kept her hands in her lap and her face turned toward the window and said, "Why are you asking me that?" "Because I want to know if you know it." "Yes." Her voice came out level. "I know it." Another long pause. Outside, the highway opened up. Gray asphalt and gray sky and the remnants of snow on the roadside from a storm 2 weeks ago. "How many times?" he said. She knew what he was asking. She thought about deflecting. She thought about the particular way he'd asked. Not with cruelty, not with the pointed satisfaction of someone who had found something to use, and decided against it. "3 times that required medical attention," she said. "Other times I managed it at home, ice, and keeping still." She paused. "You learn what heals on its own and what doesn't." The muscle in his jaw moved. "How old were you the first time?" She finally turned to look at him. He was staring straight ahead at the back of Curtis's headrest, jaw rigid, and in profile she could see the specific effort his stillness was costing him. 9, she said. He said nothing for a very long time. The highway moved under the car. Chicago's skyline began to materialize in the gray distance. "We're going back," he said to Curtis. Curtis executed a smooth lane change and took the next exit. They drove back to the manor in the same silence they'd driven out in, but it was a completely different silence now. Heavier, pressurized, the kind that contained things that hadn't yet been said and weren't ready to be. When they reached the manor and the car stopped, Dorian got out first. He walked toward the house. At the front door he stopped and turned back to look at her. She was still getting out of the car, and for a moment their eyes met across the gravel drive in the cold November air. He looked like a man who had discovered that the war he'd been fighting had been waged against the wrong person. Then he went inside and she followed, and neither of them spoke about it again. Not that day. The shift was not dramatic. That was the thing about it. She had expected drama, because in her experience, men like Dorian Moretti expressed changed calculations through action, through force, through something visible and decisive. Instead, what happened was quieter, and in some ways more disorienting than anger would have been. He stopped leaving the room when she entered it. He had done this consistently for the first month, not always, not obviously, but there was a pattern. If she came into the kitchen while he was there, within 3 minutes he found a reason to be elsewhere. If she walked through the main hall while he was on the phone, he moved deeper into the study and closed the door. It was the behavior of a man managing proximity to something he had decided to treat as adversarial. He stopped doing it. He didn't become warm. He didn't soften. He sat at the kitchen table reading his files while she drank her tea by the window, and the silence between them shifted from charged to something that was not quite comfortable, but was less weaponized. He passed her the newspaper when she sat down to breakfast without her asking. He told Hilda, within her earshot, that there were to be fresh-cut flowers kept in the library because the room needed more light. Small things. Precise and deliberate and deniable as anything. But she noticed all of them, and she was very afraid of what it meant that she noticed, because the worst thing, the most dangerous thing, was not Dorian Moretti as her enemy. She had known how to survive enemies her entire life. Her whole childhood had been structured around surviving the specific enmity of a man who was supposed to love her. Enemies she understood. What she didn't know how to survive was something that felt, in its earliest and most tentative form, like someone paying attention to her as though her comfort had value. She didn't trust it. She wasn't built to trust it, but she felt it accumulating around her in the cold November air of Blackthorn Manor, like the beginning of something she didn't have a name for, and it terrified her more than the locked doors ever had. Luca came to the manor on a Wednesday. He arrived with two other men she didn't know, all three of them carrying themselves with the casual physical confidence of people who spent a lot of time around violence, and went directly into the conference room with Dorian and Enzo and two others. The door closed. She heard voices through it, not words. She went to the library. An hour later, the meeting ended. She heard the men in the hallway, the particular low rhythm of men winding down a conversation that had mattered. She heard Luca's voice, distinctive, a slight roughness at the back of it, and then laughter at something he'd said, and then another voice, lower, that she couldn't make out. She turned her page and did not look up. 10 minutes later, Dorian appeared in the library doorway. She looked at him. "You should know," he said, "that Luca Ferrante is no longer working within the organization." She kept her expression neutral. "I see." He had a pattern of behavior that was brought to my attention. His voice was flat and controlled, and he was watching her with that new quality of attention, the one that had replaced pure calculation. It had apparently been ongoing for some time and had been overlooked for reasons that were not adequate. She thought about the slow smile across the conference table, the evaluating look, the specific way that kind of attention, for men like that in places like that, had always been the prelude to something worse. How long had it been ongoing, she asked. Long enough. And the men who overlooked it. Something moved across his face. Being addressed. She looked back at her book. "Thank you," she said quietly. It cost her something to say it. There was a version of herself that wanted to refuse gratitude, that had learned through long training not to depend on anyone's intervention, because intervention was always temporary and always transactional. But she said it. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer. "The housekeeper in Evanston," he said. She went very still. Her eyes stayed on the page. "Her name is Marta Ibanez," he said. "She worked for your family for 6 years. She left in 2019. He paused. "Do you know her?" Serafina set the book face down in her lap. She looked at him. "Marta made sure I ate," she said. When my father was in one of his periods, she would leave food outside the door." She paused. "I don't know how she got it past the lock. She must have found a way." The silence that followed was very long. Dorian's hand was on the doorframe, and she watched it tighten. Not much, barely perceptibly, but she watched it. "I want to offer her a position here," he said, "on the household staff, if that would be acceptable to you." She stared at him. He stared back. "You're asking me," she said. Yes. She had not been asked her preference about anything since she had arrived at Blackthorn Manor. She had not been asked her preference about anything for years before that. She looked at the window. The lake was dark under the afternoon cloud cover, barely distinguishable from the sky at this distance. "Yes," she said, "that would be acceptable." He nodded once and left, and she sat in the library chair with the book in her lap and looked at the gray water and felt something shift in her chest. Something old and calcified that was not quite cracking, but was acknowledging under protest the existence of pressure. She did not permit herself to feel grateful yet. Gratitude was a vulnerability she'd been punished for before, but she felt the pressure. She turned her page. Enzo Calabrese had been Dorian Moretti's consigliere for 14 years. In that time, he had watched Dorian build the Moretti organization out of the ruins his father's generation had left behind, methodically, brutally, and with a strategic intelligence that was genuinely formidable. He had also watched Dorian marry once before, at 28, a woman named Claire, who had lasted 18 months before the isolation and the danger and the particular grinding weight of life inside the Moretti world had broken her comprehensively. Claire was living in Portland now, remarried, as far removed from all of this as geography could manage. Enzo had hoped, in the abstract and private way he hoped for things, that Dorian would eventually find something better than what his life had become. A machine of controlled grievance, running on old pain and the procedural satisfaction of strategic victories. He had not expected the vehicle of that potential better thing to arrive as Vincent Vale's daughter. He found Dorian in the courtyard on a Thursday evening, cold air, the first real threat of serious snow in the clouds massing over the lake. Dorian standing near the stone wall that bordered the north side of the property, with a glass of something in his hand and his jacket open despite the temperature, looking at nothing. Enzo came to stand beside him. They looked at nothing together for a while. Rafe's second report came in, Enzo said. I know, I read it. The surveillance footage. I know. A pause. Below the bluff, the lake moved in the darkness, a vast cold shifting. Dorian, don't. I'm not going to say anything you haven't already thought. Enzo turned his glass between his hands. I'm just noting that what was done to that woman, in that house, while her father attended fundraisers and shook hands with senators, that's not peripheral information. That's the information. Dorian said nothing. The plan, as I understood it, Enzo continued carefully, was to use her presence here as an ongoing I know what the plan was. The plan assumed she was complicit, or at least indifferent, that she was Vale's daughter in the way that mattered. Enzo paused. She's his daughter in a different way. I know, Dorian said, very quiet. So what now? The question sat in the cold air between them. Below, the lake. Above, the clouds closing in, dense and gray. The first suggestion of snow beginning to drift down in isolated flakes that caught the manor's exterior lights before disappearing into the dark. I don't know yet, Dorian said. It was the most honest thing Enzo had heard him say in a long time. The nightmares came again on a Thursday. She had gone to bed at 11, which was later than usual, and had managed, through the particular exhaustion of a day that had required more internal labor than most, to fall asleep without the usual interval of lying awake listening to the manor settle and breathe around her. She had been dreaming something manageable, something about water, and then the dream had shifted the way it always did, and she was back in the dark and the smell of mildew and the specific quality of silence that existed only below ground. She came awake gasping at 2:17 a.m. She didn't make it to the bathroom floor this time. She sat up in bed and pressed her back against the headboard and focused on the window, where the exterior lights of the manor were visible through the curtain, and did her arithmetic. You are not there. You are here. You are intact. It took longer than usual. She was still sitting up, spine against the headboard, breathing with deliberate control, when she heard the footsteps in the hall. Not fast this time. Steady, measured, approaching her door and then stopping. A pause. A knock. Quiet. 2 knuckles. She stared at the door. I'm fine, she said. Her voice was almost steady. A longer pause from the hallway. Then, I know. His voice through the door, low and even. I just wanted you to know I heard. She sat with that. You've been listening, she said. Yes. Since the first time. Another pause. Yes. She looked at the window. Snow was falling now. She could see it in the exterior light, soft and dense, the first real snow of the season settling onto the bluff and the dead garden and the surface of the lake below. You don't have to stand in the hallway, she said. The door opened. He came in, still dressed, she registered, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either, which meant the insomnia was mutual and had been for some time. He was in dark trousers and a shirt with the collar open, no jacket, and he moved to the chair near the window without being directed and sat down in it and looked at the snow. She pulled the blanket up around her shoulders, not for warmth, for something that was close to armor, and looked at the snow too. "Does it happen every night?" he asked. "Not every night." She paused. "Twice a week, usually. Sometimes more." "Since when?" "Since—" She stopped. "Recalibrated." "For a long time." He absorbed this without comment. Outside, the snow fell with the particular quality of the first real snow of a season. Purposeful, accumulating, quieting the world beneath it. "What does it feel like?" he said. Not intrusively, the way someone asks a question they don't have a right to but can't stop themselves from asking. She considered not answering. She had not told anyone what it felt like, ever, because there had never been anyone to tell. "Like I can't move," she said. "Like there's something over my face. And the sound, the lock, that specific sound. I hear it during the day sometimes, random sounds that are close to it. A car door, a filing cabinet." She kept her eyes on the snow. "It takes a moment to get back." He said nothing, but she heard his breathing change. A slow, deliberate breath in and out that sounded like a man processing something painful through the only channel available to him. "I've been reading," he said. She looked at him. "About what it does to a person. Extended periods of—" He stopped. His jaw was tight. "I've been reading." "Why?" she said. He looked at her. It was the first time since the first days of the marriage that he'd looked at her directly for more than a second or two, and the thing in his eyes that she saw now was nothing like calculation. It was something rawer than that, something that looked almost like it hurt him. "Because I needed to understand what I was looking at," he said. She held his gaze. "And?" she said. "And I understand it better than I did." He looked back at the window. "Which doesn't fix anything." "No," she agreed. The snow fell. She thought about what it would cost her to say the next thing. She thought about all the things she had not been permitted to say for 25 years, and about the way this man had stood in her hallway at 2 in the morning because he'd heard her wake up frightened, and about the flowers in the library, and about Marta in Evanston who left food outside a locked door when a child was inside. "I don't think you are supposed to turn into someone who reads about it," she said. "No," he said. "I wasn't." "What were you supposed to turn into?" A pause. Something moved across his face, something complicated and unresolved and very human. "Something worse than this," he said. She looked at the snow. He looked at the snow. Between them, the chair and the 3 feet of space, and the whole weight of everything that had been done and not done, and said and not said, sitting in the cold air of the room like something that was very slowly, painfully, becoming something else. She had been awake for an hour when he finally stood. "Try to sleep," he said. "You too." He moved toward the door and she watched his back, the set of his shoulders, the deliberate way he carried all of that controlled tension, and felt the thing in her chest press outward again. That calcified thing. Under pressure it did not crack, but it acknowledged. He stopped at the door. He didn't turn around. "I'm going to dismantle everything your father built," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Every account, every arrangement, every protection he has left." A pause. "I want you to know that." She looked at his back. "I know," she said. "It's not—" He stopped. Started again. "It won't undo any of it." "I know that too." He stood in the doorway for 3 more seconds, hand on the frame, and then he walked out and pulled the door gently closed behind him. Serafina sat in the dark with the snow falling outside and her blanket pulled up like armor, and the pressure in her chest, and thought, "This is the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to me. Not the worst." The worst had been other things, in other rooms, in a darkness she had survived through sheer accumulation of days. But this careful, reluctant, unasked-for kindness from a man who had specifically arrived in her life to destroy it. This was the most dangerous thing she had ever experienced, because she could feel herself beginning to believe in it. And belief, in her experience, had always been the precursor to the worst of the pain. The 4th week of November arrived with a cold front that drove the temperature down into the single digits and kept the lake perpetually dark and agitated, whitecaps visible from every north-facing window in the manor. Dorian's operations in the city intensified. She knew this from the increased traffic through the house, the late-night phone calls audible through the walls, Enzo appearing twice in 1 week with files she wasn't shown and expressions she was learning to read. Something was building. She didn't know what shape it was taking, but she could feel it in the changed quality of the house's atmosphere, the way you feel pressure change before a storm. On the second Thursday of that week, she found Dorian in the kitchen at midnight. He was standing at the counter eating leftover pasta directly from the container, jacket off, looking at something on his phone with the particular vacant focus of extreme exhaustion. He looked up when she entered. She had come down for water. She did that sometimes when sleep was difficult, the simple act of moving through the house making the architecture feel less like a cage. She stopped. He looked at her. "Sit down," he said. "I was just getting water." "I know. Sit down anyway." She sat at the kitchen table. He poured water from the filter pitcher into a glass and set it in front of her, then leaned back against the counter with his container of pasta and his phone and looked at her with the exhaustion showing clearly in his face, which it almost never did. He looked, in that moment, like a man and not a machine. "There's something I need to tell you about the next few weeks," he said. "All right? Things are going to become more visible. Movements against your father's financial structure. Things that will be reported and noticed. There will be pressure on people connected to the Vale name." He paused. "Some of that pressure may come toward you. People may attempt contact, may attempt to use you for leverage." She held her glass. "To get to you?" "Yes." "What do you want me to do?" He looked at her directly. "I want you to tell me, immediately, without calculating whether it's in your interest or his. If anyone approaches you, if anything feels wrong." She thought about this, about the implicit trust being requested from a man who had told her 3 weeks ago that she breathed when he allowed it. "That's a different relationship than the one you described when we arrived here," she said. "Yes." "What changed?" The question landed in the kitchen air and sat there. He looked at his pasta, then at her, then at the window where the snow from earlier in the week had left a residue of ice along the lower edge. "I got better information," he said. It wasn't a complete answer. She knew it, and he knew she knew it, but it was an honest one. She drank her water. "I'll tell you," she said. He nodded. She stood to leave. At the kitchen doorway, she stopped without turning around. "Dorian." A pause, the first time she had used his name. "What?" he said. "Whatever you're building against him." She kept her back to him, her hand on the door frame, her voice very careful and very level. "Don't do it for me. Do it for the right reasons. Do it because men who do what he did shouldn't be protected by money and fear." A pause. "If you do it for me, it makes me something I don't want to be." Silence. Then from behind her, very quiet, "I know the difference." She walked back upstairs. In his kitchen, Dorian Moretti set down his pasta container and pressed both palms flat on the counter and looked at the tile backsplash and breathed, one long, deliberate breath in and out, as the full weight of what he had built and what he had planned and what it had been aimed at settled over him with new and irreversible clarity. He had married her to destroy the Vale bloodline from the inside. He had brought her to this house to suffer slowly under his supervision. And somewhere in the past 4 weeks, without a single dramatic moment or declared decision, everything about that had become impossible. Not because she had softened him. She had done nothing to soften him, had asked for nothing, had offered nothing that resembled manipulation or appeal. She had simply existed in his house with her quiet survival and her books and her nightmares and her precise, careful words, and he had watched. And what he had watched had been so far from what he had expected that his entire architecture of grievance had begun to feel like what it was, a construction built on assumptions that were wrong. He stood in his kitchen with his palms on the counter and admitted, alone and without ceremony, that his war was pointed at the wrong enemy. Had been pointed at the wrong enemy. Since the beginning. He straightened, picked up his phone, looked at the time. Then he called Rafe. "Tomorrow morning," he said when Rafe picked up. "Everything. I want everything on Vincent Vale. Not just the financial, all of it. I want something that survives a courtroom or a headline." He paused. "And I want to know who else knew. Because one man doesn't hide that for 20 years without help." He ended the call. Outside, the lake lay dark and cold under the November sky. And in a house on the north side of Chicago, in a room she had not been permitted to leave, Serafina Vale had once spent years in the dark, listening to the particular sound of a lock clicking shut. Dorian Moretti stood in his kitchen and felt, for the first time in his life, something that wasn't anger or strategy or the controlled machinery of revenge. He felt the specific, annihilating weight of a wrong that could not be undone, only answered. He was halfway back to his study when the call came in. Enzo. Which meant it was serious. Enzo didn't call after midnight for anything that could wait. Talk, Dorian said. We have a problem. Enzo's voice was flat and careful, in the way that indicated the problem was significant. The Castellano situation. The breach we discussed last week. It wasn't what we thought it was. What was it? A pause. It was a message. From Vincent Vale. Enzo paused again. He knows she's been talking to you. He knows something changed, and he's decided that if he can't use her as a disposal, Enzo, he's going to make sure she can't be used against him either. The hallway was very cold and very quiet. What does that mean? Dorian said, though he already knew. The hallway outside his study was narrow and cold and lit by a single wall sconce that threw more shadow than light, and he stood in it with the phone pressed to his ear and his free hand very still at his side, and waited for Enzo to say the thing that was already assembling itself in his chest, like something with weight. It means he's contracted someone to remove her, Enzo said, flat, precise. The voice of a man delivering information with the emotion surgically extracted because the emotion would not help. We intercepted a communication through the Castellano channel, which, as I said, wasn't a breach. It was a delivery system. Vale used Castellano as a cutout to reach someone inside our network. Dorian didn't move. Inside, he said. Yes. How far inside? A pause that lasted exactly 2 seconds too long. We're still determining that, Enzo said. Dorian turned and walked into his study and closed the door. He stood at the desk without sitting, one hand on the surface looking at the wall. Who knows about this call right now? He said. You and me. Keep it that way until morning. Put 2 additional men on her floor. Men you've personally cleared. No one from the last 3 months of intake. No one connected to any of the Castellano dealings. Already done. I called you after I moved them. Good. Dorian pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and breathed. The inside contact. How close are we to a name? Hours, maybe less. Rafe is running the communication trace now. When you have it, you'll be the first call. He ended the call and stood in the silence of his study with the lamp on the desk throwing a yellow circle onto the files he'd been working through before midnight, and he thought about the conversation in the kitchen 20 minutes ago. Serafina at the table with her water glass and her careful words, and the way she had stood in the doorway with her back to him and said, "Don't do it for me," and the way her voice had been so precisely level that the effort of keeping it that way was audible underneath. He thought about what it would mean for that woman to die in this house, in his house, under his supposed protection, because her father, the man who had locked her in a basement for years and broken her ribs and disposed of her into a mafia marriage like a liability being written off a balance sheet, had decided that her survival was an inconvenience to him. Something moved through Dorian Moretti that was not anger. Anger was something he knew well, had known since he was 23 years old, and standing at his brother Marco's funeral in the rain and listening to the priest say words about peace that meant nothing. Anger was familiar. He could work with anger. He had built an entire decade of his life on it. This was different. This was something beneath anger, something older and more absolute, something that didn't have a clean name. He picked up his phone again and called a number he hadn't called in 4 months. It rang twice. I need the Vale estate under full surveillance as of right now, he said when the line connected. Every exit, every vehicle, every communication in or out. He paused. And I need to know the location of Vincent Vale at all times starting immediately. He moves, I know about it before he's finished moving. He hung up. He stood at his desk for one more moment, looking at the files, at the photographs Rafe had included in the second report. Images from the surveillance footage, time-stamped, that he had not been able to look at for more than 30 seconds at a time. He looked at them now, made himself look. Then he picked up his jacket and went upstairs. Timas. He didn't knock this time. He opened her door quietly. The two men stationed in the hallway acknowledged him with nods, eyes forward, and looked into the room. The lamp on the nightstand was on, which meant she hadn't gone back to sleep after coming upstairs. She was in the bed with her back against the headboard, knees pulled up, a book open in her lap that she clearly wasn't reading because her eyes came up the moment the door moved. She looked at him. He looked at her. "What happened?" she said. Not a question, a recognition. She had been reading the atmosphere of threatening men her entire life. She knew the particular quality of a face that had just received bad news and was deciding how much of it to transmit. "There may be a security concern," he said. He kept his voice level and his face controlled. "It's being addressed. I need you to stay in this room until I tell you otherwise." She studied him for 3 full seconds. "How serious?" "Serious enough that I'm here at midnight telling you about it." "Is it my father?" He held her gaze. "I don't know the full shape of it yet." It was technically true. It was also not the whole truth, and she was perceptive enough to know the difference. He watched her absorb that, watched her take the partial truth and file it in the place where she kept all the things she knew she wasn't being told, the place that had been accumulating entries since she was 8 years old. "All right," she said. "I mean it. This room. Do you understand?" "Yes." He held her eyes for 1 more second. Then he pulled the door closed and went back downstairs to wait for Rafe to call. The name came at 4:17 in the morning. Dorian was in his study, not sleeping, working through the financial architecture of Vincent Vale's remaining legitimate holdings, the properties, the investment vehicles, the political relationships that were currently all that stood between Vale and the kind of exposure that ended careers and began trials. The work kept his hands busy while the rest of him waited. His phone lit up. "Rafe." "Talk," Dorian said. "The inside contact is Benedetto Crane." A pause. "He's been on the payroll for 6 years. Logistics coordinator. He had access to the transport schedules, the rotation patterns, the internal communication channels." Another pause, with more weight behind it. "He also had access to the floor plans for the manor." Dorian said nothing. "He transmitted a full package to the Vale cutout 48 hours ago," Rafe continued. "Entry points, guard positions, her room location." The line was quiet for a moment. "Dorian, he transmitted her room location. Where is he now?" "We have him in the lower level. He was pulled 40 minutes ago. He doesn't know yet what we know. The men who brought him in used a cover reason." "I'll be down in 10 minutes." He stood, straightened his shirt, and walked out of the study. "What?" The lower level of Blackthorn Manor was not a place that appeared on the property's listed floor plan. It occupied the space beneath the east wing, accessed through a staircase behind a panel in the main kitchen, stone-walled and low-ceilinged and lit by overhead fluorescents that stripped all warmth from the air. It was used for storage, primarily, and occasionally for other things. Benedetto Crane was 41 years old, medium height, with a forgettable face that had served him well in a career built on going unnoticed. He was sitting in a chair near the center of the room with his wrists zip-tied in front of him and 2 of Dorian's men stationed behind him, and he was doing a reasonable job of looking calm, which told Dorian that he hadn't yet fully understood his situation. Dorian came in and stood across from him and looked at him for 10 seconds without speaking. Crane met his eyes. "There's some kind of problem?" "Tell me about Vincent Vale," Dorian said. The change in Crane's face was small, a barely perceptible tightening around the eyes, a micro-adjustment in the set of his jaw. Small, but there. Dorian had been reading faces for 20 years. "I don't know what you're referring to," Crane said. Dorian crouched down so they were at eye level. He did it slowly, deliberately, not as a show of force but as a removal of distance, which was more unsettling than force in his experience. He looked at Crane from 18 inches away. 48 hours ago," Dorian said, "you transmitted a package to a cutout operating for Vincent Vale. The package included the interior layout of this building, guard rotation schedules, and the location of the room where my wife sleeps." He paused. "I want to understand why." Crane's jaw was tight. His breathing had changed. "I want a lawyer. That's not an option that exists in this room." Dorian kept his voice level and quiet. "What exists in this room is a conversation that you can choose to participate in honestly, which will result in outcomes better than the alternative. He tilted his head slightly. Why? Crane looked at the floor. How much did he pay you? Dorian said. Nothing. How long has he had access to you? Nothing. Did he give you a timeline, a window for the operation? Crane's breathing had become audible now, shallow and quick, the body betraying what the face was working to conceal. Dorian watched it and waited with the patience of a man who had learned that silence, applied consistently, did more work than pressure. It took 4 minutes. 2 years, Crane said finally. His voice had dropped to something rough and unsteady. He's had a line into this organization for 2 years. Not through me. I was the most recent addition. There were others before. Dorian kept his expression contained. Names. I only know one. The others were compartmentalized. I wasn't given names. I was given drop points and signals. He exhaled. Reyes. Danny Reyes in the Southside Logistics Unit. He was the first. He was turned before I was approached. Dorian filed this. The timeline. The operation against my wife. Crane looked at the floor for a long moment. His wrists strained slightly against the zip tie. An involuntary movement. The body trying to create options the mind knew didn't exist. He wanted it done before the end of the month. Before whatever you're building against him gets far enough to matter. A pause. He said she was a loose end, that she knew things. Crane's voice had developed a slight tremor. He said she'd always been a loose end. The room was very quiet. She knew things, Dorian repeated. That's what he said. What things? Crane looked up. I don't know. He didn't tell me. He just said she was a liability that should have been addressed years ago, and that the current arrangement was too close, too much risk of her talking. He paused. His words were, he said she was always going to end up this way. Like he'd been waiting for an excuse. Dorian stood up from his crouch. He stood very still for a moment, looking at a point on the wall above Crane's head, doing the interior work required to keep his face from communicating what was happening in his chest. Then he looked back at Crane. The other men he has inside this organization, Dorian said, aside from Reyes. You said there were others. I think there are. I don't know how many. But you communicated with someone to transmit the package. Someone inside who verified the information. A pause. Yes. Who? Crane's jaw worked. If I tell you, I'm dead regardless. You're having a conversation and providing information that will be taken into account, Dorian said. That's the only distinction available to you right now, and it is a real distinction. Who? Crane looked at the floor, looked at Dorian, said a name. The name landed in the room like something thrown from height. Dorian looked at Crane for 3 more seconds. Then he turned and walked to the staircase and went upstairs without speaking to either of the men stationed in the room. In the kitchen, he stopped. The name Crane had said was Enzo Calabrese. He stood in the kitchen for 90 seconds. He stood there and breathed and let the information move through him with the particular quality of a revelation that was also, on some deeper level, a confirmation of a fear so old he had never fully allowed it into conscious thought. Enzo had been beside him for 14 years, had helped him build everything, had attended Marco's funeral and stood with him in the rain and said the right things, had been the voice on the phone at midnight 40 minutes ago saying the inside contact was Benedetto Crane, which meant Enzo had been the one to decide what information reached Dorian and what information was redirected, managed, controlled. For how long, he didn't yet know, but long enough. Long enough. He picked up his phone. He called Rafe's number and let it ring twice and then ended the call. Their established signal for come in person. Now. Say nothing on any line. Then he stood in his kitchen in the 4 a.m. darkness and felt the architecture of the last 14 years rearrange itself into a shape he didn't yet fully understand but could already see was worse than anything he had calculated. Enzo had been on the call tonight. Enzo had told him the inside contact was Crane, which meant Enzo had known about the operation against Serafina, possibly had facilitated it, possibly had been facilitating things, many things, for much longer than one operation. Dorian pressed his palm flat against the kitchen counter and breathed, slow and deliberate, through the specific quality of rage that lived beneath rational thought. that older and more absolute thing he had felt earlier in the evening, and he kept himself very still, and he waited. Rafe arrived in 11 minutes. He came through the east entrance, a door that Dorian had unlocked remotely from his phone, and appeared in the kitchen doorway with his jacket on over what were clearly clothes he'd been sleeping in, silver hair disordered, eyes already fully alert. He looked at Dorian's face and said nothing. Dorian said the name. Rafe was quiet for a long time. "Tell me what you know," Dorian said. "Not what you suspected, not what you heard in passing, what you know." Rafe sat down at the kitchen table and put both hands on the surface and looked at them. In 11 years, Dorian had seen Rafe DeLuca uncomfortable 3 times. This was a different category. 6 months ago, Rafe said, I found an anomaly in the communication logs from a negotiation with the Delgado Group. A timestamp that didn't correspond to any sanctioned transmission. I traced it as far as I could and lost it 2 nodes out. He paused. The trajectory of what I lost it into was consistent with the Veil organization's communication architecture. He looked up. I didn't bring it to Enzo. I brought it directly to you. Dorian thought back. 6 months ago. Rafe had brought him an anomaly report in October. He had read it, noted it, referred it back to Enzo for investigation. I referred it to Enzo, Dorian said. Yes. The kitchen was very quiet. I didn't know, Rafe said. I want to be clear. I had a fragment. I had a direction. I didn't have a name or a confirmation. If I had confirmed it, I would have come to you directly regardless of... I know, Dorian said. And he did know. Rafe was one of 3 people in his life he trusted without reservation, and that trust was based on 11 years of evidence, not sentiment. He knew. Which meant the list of people in this house whose loyalty he could be certain of had just become very short. I need to know the full scope, Dorian said. How long? How deep? How much he's transmitted? I need it as fast as it can be done, and I need it done without involving anyone who hasn't been in this room tonight. He paused. And I need you to find out where Enzo is right now. Rafe pulled out his phone. One more thing, Dorian said. Rafe looked up. The operation against my wife. The timeline Crane gave us, end of the month. I need to know whether that's still the operative timeline or whether something was accelerated when Crane was pulled tonight. He held Rafe's gaze. If Enzo knows Crane was pulled, he does, Rafe said. He would have been notified through standard protocol. Dorian exhaled once. Then we may have less time than we thought. He went upstairs at 5:15. The 2 men in the hallway were men he trusted. They had been with the organization for 8 and 11 years, respectively. Had been with him through things that built the kind of loyalty that didn't bend to outside money. He stopped and spoke with each of them quietly for 2 minutes apiece, recalibrating their instructions, telling them only what they needed to know. Then he went to her door and knocked twice with 2 knuckles. It's me, he said through the door. A brief silence. Then, come in. She was still in the same position, back against the headboard, knees up, the book closed now in her lap. The lamp threw its warm circle. She looked at him when he came in with that careful reading expression, and he watched her take in his face and the hour and the particular way he was carrying his body and arrive, with the speed of someone who had spent a lifetime decoding threatening men, at the understanding that something had escalated. Tell me the truth this time, she said quietly. He pulled the chair to the foot of the bed and sat in it, leaning forward with his forearms on his knees, and looked at her directly. Your father has contacts inside this organization, he said. We've identified some of them. We're working on the full scope tonight. He passed information about your location and your routine to someone who was tasked with. He stopped, recalibrated. He wants to make sure you can't speak to anyone about what you know. She looked at him. What I know, she repeated. That's what his operative said. She was quiet for a moment. Her hands were folded over the closed book in her lap, and she was looking at a point near his left shoulder, thinking, and he watched her think, watched the precise, careful movement of her mind behind her eyes. Sorting information, testing it. There are things I know, she said slowly, that go beyond what was done to me personally. She paused. My father, his financial arrangements, his political relationships. I was in that house for 25 years. I sat at the table during conversations I wasn't supposed to be able to hear. She looked at Dorian directly. He covered himself well, but not perfectly. And I have a very good memory. For names, Dorian said. For everything. The room held that. Why didn't you tell me this before? He said. Because it was the only thing I had that was mine. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it. Something that was not accusation, but was close to it. The only leverage. The only thing between me and being completely without value to anyone. She paused. I didn't know yet whether you were someone I could put it down in front of. He held her gaze. It cost him something, looking at her like this. At the particular economy of self-preservation she'd been operating under, the way she had sat in this house for a month and calculated and weighed and waited, rationing her trust with the precision of someone who had run out of it before. He recognized it. He had done versions of it himself. He had just done them from positions of power rather than captivity. And now? He said. She looked at him for a long moment. Now my father is trying to have me killed, she said, which adjusts the calculation. She reached to the nightstand and opened the small drawer and removed a folded piece of paper. She held it out to him. He looked at it, then at her. Take it, she said. The echo of his own words from the night with the blanket, back at him. He took it, unfolded it. It was a handwritten list, dates, names, amounts, locations, written in a small, precise hand, condensed but legible. The kind of record a person keeps when they know they cannot keep records anywhere they might be found, and so they keep them in their memory and transcribe them only when they have a safe moment and a reason. He scanned it once, then again more slowly. What he was reading was not complete. It had the gaps and approximations of information gathered by a child and a young woman from overheard conversations and glimpsed documents. But what was there was significant. Names he recognized from law enforcement briefings, transactions that touched political figures in 3 states, a date in 2016 that aligned with an event he had wondered about for years and had never been able to trace to its origin. He looked up. You've been carrying this, he said. Yes. For how long? Since I was 14. She met his eyes. I didn't know what I would do with it. I just knew I needed to have it. He folded the paper carefully and held it in both hands and looked at her, at this woman who had survived a basement and broken bones and a forced marriage to a man who had told her she breathed when he allowed it, and who had spent all of it accumulating knowledge because knowledge was the only form of armor available to someone with no physical power and no allies. He had spent a decade believing that the Vale family was his enemy. He had been wrong in a way that was not correctable, not undoable, not forgiven with a gesture or a blanket or fresh flowers in a library. But it could be answered, in the only way things like this could be answered. I need to move you, he said. Not far. Another property. Somewhere Vale's contacts don't have layout information on. Tonight, before morning. She looked at him. Will you come? He said. Not in order. Asking. She studied his face for 3 seconds. The same careful read she'd been performing for a month, looking for the thing beneath the surface, the thing that would tell her whether what was being offered was real or tactical. Then she said, Yes. He stood. Get dressed. Take what you need for a week. Nothing that can't fit in one bag. She was already moving toward the closet when the sound came from downstairs. Not loud, not immediately alarming. A door, somewhere in the east wing, opening and closing with a controlled click that shouldn't have been audible from the 3rd floor. Shouldn't have been, except that the 2 men in the hallway had been trained to notice things like that. And she heard through the door the sudden change in their posture, the quiet exchange of 4 words she couldn't make out. Dorian was already at the door. He opened it, looked at the man on the right. The man said very quietly, East entrance 20 seconds ago. The alarm was disarmed from inside. Dorian looked at him. Enzo's access code, the man said. Something moved across Dorian's face that she had never seen there before. Not the controlled anger she had catalogued, not the measured calculation. Something raw, something that looked, from where she was standing in her bare feet in the middle of her room with one hand on her closet door, like something that looked from where she was standing in her bare feet in the middle of her room with one hand on her closet door, like grief. It lasted 1 second. Then it was gone, and what replaced it was something she had not seen on him before either. Not the controlled, calculated authority she had spent a month cataloging, but something older and more absolute, something that operated below the level of strategy, something that had been waiting underneath all of it for a reason to come forward. He turned back into the room. "Under the bed," he said. "Now." Dorian, now Serafina. The way he said her name, the first time he had used it, she registered with a distant and almost clinical part of her brain that kept cataloging things even when the rest of her was operating on adrenaline, stopped her for exactly half a second. Then she dropped to the floor and rolled under the bed frame and pressed herself flat against the cold hardwood in the darkness beneath the mattress and listened. She heard him move to the door, heard the two men in the hallway, a low exchange of 4 words, the sound of positions shifting. Heard a door somewhere below, farther into the east wing now, moving inward through the building. And then silence, and then footsteps on a staircase, and then nothing for 30 seconds that felt like 10 minutes. She pressed her cheek to the cold floor and breathed through her nose and did her arithmetic. "You are here. You are intact. You are still here." It didn't work as well as it usually did. Enzo Calabrese came up the east staircase with 2 men she didn't know. Dorian was waiting at the top. He was standing in the hallway with his hands at his sides and his face arranged into something that was almost normal, almost the controlled, assessing expression she had spent a month learning to read. And he watched Enzo come up the last 3 steps and onto the landing and stop. Enzo stopped because of the 2 men flanking Dorian who were not part of the normal overnight rotation and who were holding themselves with a specific quality of readiness. The 2 men with Enzo stopped because of the same thing. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Enzo looked at Dorian. Something moved across his face, fast, almost imperceptible, a calculation being completed and discarded and replaced. Then he settled into an expression that was also almost normal, almost the measured, watchful expression of 14 years of consigliere work, and said, "We have a problem with the east perimeter. I came into—" "Stop," Dorian said. Enzo stopped. The hallway was very narrow and the overhead light was dim, and in the dimness, the 2 groups of men looked at each other with the particular stillness of people who understand that movement will cost something. "The east entrance alarm was disarmed with your code," Dorian said. 3 in the morning. After a conversation in which you personally identified Benedetto Crane as the inside contact. He paused. "You came in through the entrance whose layout Crane transmitted to Vincent Vale 48 hours ago." Another pause. "With men I don't recognize." Enzo's face didn't change. "I can explain the—" "Can you?" Silence. Dorian took 1 step forward. Just 1. But it was the kind of step that communicated the full weight of what was standing behind it. 14 years, he said. His voice was very quiet. The quietness of it was more frightening than volume would have been. 14 years, Enzo. My brother's funeral. The Delgado negotiation. Every operation since 2021 that I ran through you before I ran it anywhere else. He paused. How much of it went to Vale? One of the men behind Enzo shifted his weight. The man on Dorian's right moved. What happened next happened fast. A compressed, brutal interval of motion and impact that lasted perhaps 8 seconds and left one of the unknown men on the floor with his arm at an angle it wasn't designed for, and the other pressed against the wall with a forearm across his throat, and Enzo standing alone on the landing with his hands raised and his face, for the first time in 14 years, fully unguarded. He looked like a man who was tired. It wasn't... He stopped. His hands were up, palms out, and he was looking at Dorian with an expression that was the most honest thing Dorian had ever seen on him. It wasn't about money. Then what? He has my daughter. Enzo's voice had changed completely, stripped of the professional evenness, raw underneath. She's been under his control for 2 years, an arrangement she entered under circumstances I was not. He stopped, breathed. I had no way out of it that didn't end with her dead, you understand? There was no version of this where I could come to you and tell you, because the first communication I had with anyone inside this organization about it, he would have... He stopped again. His hands were still up. The hallway was very quiet. Dorian looked at him for a long time. Where is she? Dorian said. A property in Wicker Park. He has 3 men on her. Enzo's voice was wrecked. She doesn't... She thinks she's there voluntarily. He's managed it so carefully that she doesn't understand what the situation is. How old? 24, Dorian breathed. And in exchange for her safety, Dorian said, you've been feeding him information for 2 years. Yes, including the layout of this house, including my wife's location. Enzo's jaw moved. He told me it was for leverage, that he wasn't going to, and you believed that. Silence. No, Enzo said. I didn't believe it, but I didn't have another option I could find. The man pinned against the wall was making small sounds of distress that nobody acknowledged. On the floor, the other man had stopped moving. Dorian looked at his consigliere of 14 years and felt, beneath the rage and the calculation and the weight of betrayal, something complicated and human that he didn't have time to fully examine. Later. There would be a later, or there wouldn't, and he would deal with it then. The men he sent tonight, Dorian said. How many? What's the timeline? Enzo's eyes changed. You knew they were coming. I've known for an hour. How many and when? 4 men. They were supposed to enter through the east wing after I secured the hallway. He paused. The window was 30 minutes from my entry. Dorian looked at the man on his right. Check the east wing. All of it. The man moved. Dorian looked back at Enzo. You're going to tell me everything you know about Vale's current position, his remaining contacts inside this organization, and the location in Wicker Park. You're going to tell me all of it right now in the next 10 minutes. He paused. Your daughter's situation will be addressed. That's not a negotiation. That's what's going to happen. But it happens after you tell me everything. Enzo looked at him for a long moment. Then he lowered his hands. All right, he said. The 4 men Vale had sent never made it past the east wing. 2 were intercepted in the ground floor corridor by the men Dorian had repositioned after Rafe's arrival. 1 was found attempting to access the east staircase and was dealt with in the stairwell with a speed and finality that left no ambiguity. The 4th got as far as the 2nd floor landing before one of the overnight rotation. A man named Garrett, who had been with the organization for 9 years and had the particular economy of movement that indicated genuine competence, removed him from the situation permanently. It was over in 4 minutes. Dorian stood in the east wing corridor afterward and looked at the evidence of it and felt the specific clarity that came after violence. That cold, sharp quality of everything being very visible and very simple, stripped down to its essential structure. 4 men sent to reach a woman in a room on the 3rd floor. 4 men who had not reached her. He went upstairs. He knocked twice on her door. It's over, he said through it. A silence. Then the sound of movement inside. Not from the direction of the bed, but from the floor. Then her voice, steadier than it had any right to be. All of them? Yes. The door opened. She was standing in the middle of the room in the dark. She'd turned off the lamp at some point during the interval, which was smart. The room would have been visible from outside with the lamp on. She was fully dressed, he registered, in dark clothes, with a bag on the bed behind her that was packed. She had gotten dressed and packed a bag while lying under a bed waiting to find out whether men were coming to kill her. He looked at her. She looked at him. We still need to move, he said. Tonight. He'll send more when these 4 don't report back. I know. She picked up the bag. Where? Rafe has a property in Evanston. 20 minutes. We leave in 5. She nodded. He turned toward the door and she followed, and as she passed through the doorway, she paused and looked at the 2 men in the hallway, the men who had been there all night, who had kept her door, and said quietly, Thank you. Neither man broke protocol to respond, but something shifted in both their expressions, almost imperceptibly, that was not nothing. The drive to Evanston was 23 minutes through streets that were dark and wet and nearly empty, the tail end of November pressing down on the city with a cold so penetrating it felt structural. Dorian sat beside her in the back of the car and said nothing for the first 15 minutes, and she said nothing either, and the silence had a different quality than any of the silences they'd occupied together in the past month. It wasn't charged. It wasn't weaponized. It was the silence of 2 people who had just come through something and were still taking inventory. At the 14-minute mark, she said, Enzo. He looked at her. I heard the voices in the hallway, she said. I couldn't hear words, but I recognized his voice. Yes. A pause. Is he? He's being held at the manor. His situation is complicated. He paused. He had leverage used against him. His daughter. She was quiet for a moment. Vale's pattern, she said. Yes. He did it to others people too. Used the people around them. I saw it more than once. She looked at the window. The dark passing city, the sodium orange glow of streetlights in the rain. It's how he survived so long. He didn't just compromise the target. He built layers. I know that now. The list I gave you, some of those names are people he holds in the same way. Not all of them were willing participants. She paused. You need to know that before you move against them. He looked at her profile. The line of her jaw, the steadiness of it, the quality of a person who had been afraid for years and had learned to think clearly through fear because fear was the permanent condition and thinking clearly was the only response available. You've been building this case in your head for 25 years, he said. She turned to look at him. Yes. You knew exactly what it would take to break him. I knew what the pressure points were. I didn't have the resources to reach them. A pause. You do. The car pulled off the highway. This is a partnership then, he said. She held his gaze. If you want it to be. He held hers back and said, yes. Rafe's property in Evanston was a 3-story brownstone on a tree-lined street, anonymous and quiet, the kind of building that was unremarkable by design. The interior was clean and spare and functional, not comfortable in any elaborate sense, but solid, which was what mattered. Rafe met them at the door and walked Dorian through the security arrangements in 4 minutes, while Serafina sat in the kitchen with a glass of water and looked at the window, and then Rafe left. And Dorian came into the kitchen and sat across from her, and they spent the next 2 hours working. She talked. He listened and wrote. She had 25 years of overheard conversations and glimpsed documents and dates that had lodged in her memory because memory was the only record she had been able to keep. And she produced it all with the careful precision of a person who has stored something for a long time and has been waiting for a sufficiently trustworthy place to put it down. By 5 in the morning, they had a map, not a complete one, but enough. Enough names, enough dates, enough transaction patterns that, combined with the financial surveillance Rafe had been building and the documentation from the Vale estate investigation, constituted something that could move, something that had weight and direction. At 5:17, Dorian's phone rang. He looked at the screen, looked at her. I need to take this, he said. She stood. I'll find a room. He caught her wrist as she moved past him. Not hard, not constraining, just a light contact, brief. And she stopped and looked down at his hand on her wrist and then up at his face. Stay, he said. She stayed. He answered the call on speaker and set the phone on the table between them. The voice on the other end was one she hadn't heard in years. A woman, mid-50s, controlled and very precise, the voice of someone with institutional authority. This is Deputy State's Attorney Marion Childs, the voice said. I've been waiting for someone to make this call for 3 years. I'm told you have documentation. Dorian looked at Serafina across the table. We have more than documentation, he said. We have a witness. The next 72 hours moved at a pace that had its own violence. Legal teams, secure communications, the careful choreography of building a case that could withstand what Vale would throw at it, which was considerable, because even cornered and with his financial structure collapsing, he still had relationships and resources and the specific dangerous energy of a man with nothing left to protect, except himself. Serafina didn't sleep more than 4 hours in any given stretch. She sat across tables from lawyers and investigators, and a federal liaison whose name she was told once and didn't retain, and she answered questions and provided context and identified documents and did the particular work of converting 25 years of silent, accumulated knowledge into a record that other people could read and understand. It was exhausting in a way that was also, underneath the exhaustion, something else. Something that felt like releasing pressure from a system that had been operating at maximum capacity for as long as she could remember. Dorian was in and out, managing the operational pieces she didn't see, dismantling the financial structures on his end with a speed and precision that suggested he had been building toward this longer than he had acknowledged, But he was present enough, present in the ways that mattered. He appeared in doorways with coffee when she had been sitting for 3 hours without moving. He sat across from her late at night when the investigators had gone and they were alone with the documents and the silence and the accumulating weight of what they were building together. He didn't offer comfort in any conventional way. He wasn't built for conventional comfort, and she didn't need it. What he offered was steadiness, presence, the specific quality of a person who was not going to leave the room. It was the most anyone had ever offered her. On the second evening, she found him on the brownstone's small back porch in the cold, looking at the alley with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, and she stood in the doorway and said, "What are you thinking about?" He looked at her. "Marco." She came out onto the porch and stood beside him. The cold pressed down, immediate and clean. "Tell me about him," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he started to talk. Slowly at first, then less so, about a younger brother who had been funny and impractical and better at people than Dorian had ever been, who had wanted to go to architecture school in Milan and had been talking about it in the months before the explosion, who had been 22 years old and who had died because someone in the Moretti organization had sold a location to a rival faction, and the rival faction had decided that a statement was more valuable than a negotiation. "The gas leak ruling," she said. "We knew it wasn't. We couldn't prove it. And then—" he stopped. "Then your grandfather's involvement came to light, and your father's, and it became something I could direct everything at, all of it." He paused. "It gave it a shape. The anger. I needed it to have a shape." She looked at the alley. "And now," she said, "now I know who actually sold the location." He said the name, someone she didn't know, someone who had been in the Moretti organization itself. "Rafe confirmed it last night. It wasn't your family. Your grandfather facilitated the introduction between the rival faction and our trader. He made money on it. But the decision, the sale, that was internal." He paused. "Your family destroyed it. They're not innocent of that. But they didn't pull the trigger." She looked at him. His profile was rigid in the cold. The glass in his hand hadn't moved. "So everything you aimed at me," she said, "was misdirected." His jaw tightened. "Yes." She breathed out. "You can't give me 10 years back," she said, "or 25. "No." "You can't undo the wedding or what you said in that room the first night." "No." She looked at the alley. A cat moved across the far end of it, paused in the light from a window, disappeared. "What I'm saying," she said, "is that the accounting is complicated. It's not clean." She paused. "What happened to me happened before you arrived. The shape that my life had before this house, that wasn't you. I made it worse. For approximately 4 weeks, yes." She paused. "And then you didn't." He looked at her. "That's not absolution," she said. "I'm not offering that, but it's accurate." She held his gaze. "I'm telling you what's accurate." He looked at her for a long moment, and the thing that moved across his face was something she had seen building over weeks. That complex, unresolved, very human thing that existed underneath all the control and the machinery and the architecture of grievance he had built his life inside. "All right," he said, very quiet. She went back inside. On the morning of the third day, the federal warrants were signed. She was sitting in the kitchen with Rafe and a lawyer named Stern when the confirmation came through, and she watched Stern read the message on his phone and exhale and say, "We're moving," and she felt something in her chest shift that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction and had no clean name. Dorian came into the kitchen 2 minutes later. "Val has been located," he said. His voice was level and controlled and completely unlike the voice that had told her she breathed when he allowed it. "He's at the estate. He has approximately 6 hours before the federal team arrives." He paused. "There's a question about what he does in those 6 hours." Stern looked up from his phone. "He runs or he destroys evidence." "Or both," Rafe said. "He won't run," Serafina said. Everyone looked at her. "He won't run," she said again. "He never ran from anything in his life. He managed it. He controlled the narrative and the people and the outcome. Running is an admission that he can't do that." She paused. "He'll try to manage this. He'll try to make calls, use whatever relationships he has left. He'll believe until the last possible moment that he can turn it. She looked at Dorian, and when he finally understands that he can't, she stopped. When he finally understands that he can't, Dorian said. He'll come for me, she said. Because in his mind, I'm the origin of everything that's collapsing. I am the evidence that moved. She held Dorian's gaze. He won't be able to stop himself. He's been telling himself for 25 years that I ruin things. The kitchen was very quiet. Then we plan for that, Dorian said. Yes, she said, and we end it. She held his gaze. Yes, she said again, and her voice did not waver, and in her chest the thing that had been calcified and pressurized, and slowly, painfully changing across 35 days at Blackthorn Manor, and 72 hours in an Evanston brownstone pressed outward one more time, with a force that was not breaking but was something immediately adjacent to it. Her phone lit up on the table. Unknown number. She looked at it, looked at Dorian. His expression had changed, that absolute below-strategy thing moving forward through the controlled surface again, filling in the lines of his face with something that was neither cold nor warm, but had the specific quality of a decision that was already made and was simply waiting for the action to catch up with it. She answered the call. Her father's voice came through the speaker, and it sounded exactly as she remembered it, controlled, pale gray, the voice of a man who believed that everything could be managed if the right pressure was applied to the right place. Serafina, he said, it's time for you to come home. She looked at Dorian across the kitchen table. Tell me where you are, she said into the phone. And Vincent Vale, who had never in his life understood that his daughter was not what he believed her to be, said, You know where I am? You've always known where this ends. The line went dead. Rafe was already on his phone, Dorian was already on his feet, and Serafina Vale, who had survived a basement and broken bones and a forced marriage, and men sent through a hallway in the dark, and 35 days of being a message, and 72 hours of being a witness, stood up from the kitchen table and picked up her jacket and felt, moving through the cold clarity of her chest, something that was not fear. It was the specific, incandescent quality of a woman who had been surviving long enough and was now, finally, ready. The word did not form in her mind as language. It was older than language. It was the specific quality of a body that had been preparing for something for 25 years and had finally arrived at the moment the preparation was for. She put on her jacket. Rafe was already running coordinates through his phone, triangulating the call. Unnecessary, because she had told them exactly where Vincent Vale was. She had always known where this would end, exactly as he'd said. The Vale family estate on the north edge of the city, 53 rooms and 40 years of secrets, and a basement she had not set foot in since she was 17 years old, and had promised herself, standing outside the locked door with her ribs taped under her shirt, that she would never enter again voluntarily. She was about to break that promise. Dorian came around the kitchen table and stopped in front of her. Close. Not touching, but close enough that she could see the specific quality of his eyes, that thing that had been building in them across 35 days and 72 hours and one phone call that had lasted 11 seconds. You don't have to go in there, he said. She looked at him steadily. Yes, I do. I can end this without Dorian. She held his gaze. He spent 25 years making me believe that I was nothing, that I ruined things simply by existing. She paused. He needs to see me walk in. That's not negotiable. He looked at her for 3 seconds, the jaw tight, the muscle moving, the controlled interior work visible just beneath the surface. Stay beside me, he said. Yes. They walked out together into the cold. The convoy was 4 vehicles, moving fast through the pre-dawn city. The federal team would arrive at the estate in 6 hours, but 6 hours was time enough for a man like Vincent Vale to make things disappear, to make people disappear. And Dorian Moretti had not spent a decade building towards something in order to let it slip through a 6-hour window. The legal architecture was Stern's work. The operational piece was his. Serafina sat in the back seat with Dorian beside her and watched Chicago move past the window. The city she had grown up in and never truly inhabited, had seen mostly through car windows and controlled itineraries and the specific kind of visibility that comes with being a wealthy family's shame. The lake appeared briefly between buildings. black and vast under the early morning dark, and she looked at it and thought about the frozen lake behind Blackthorn Manor and the night she had stood in a room on the third floor and heard a knock that was two quiet knuckles and a voice that said, "It's me," and felt, underneath all the fear and the calculation and the exhaustion, the first faint pressure of something she had not felt since she was a child. Being seen. "Tell me what the layout looks like," Dorian said beside her. Not asking for information he didn't have, Rafe had full blueprints by now, asking for her version of it, her map. She told him. Not the architectural layout, the experiential one, where the staff would be at this hour, which guards were loyal to her father personally versus institutionally, where he went when he wanted to be alone, and where he went when he wanted to feel powerful, different rooms for different purposes. She told him about the East study on the ground floor where he made his important calls. She told him about the passage behind the kitchen that connected the main house to the East wing that most of the staff didn't know about. She told him about the specific sound the alarm system made when it registered an entry at the north gate and the 12-second interval before it was acknowledged by the guard station. She told him all of it from memory, precisely, and he listened with absolute attention, and Rafe in the front seat took notes he didn't need to take because everything she said was already covered by the intelligence they had. But the act of her saying it, of her laying the architecture of her captivity out in the open air of a moving car, had a quality that was different from briefing. It was closer to something else. When she finished, Dorian was quiet for a moment. "He's going to try to use you," he said. "When he sees you, he's going to try to make you doubt what you've done." "I know. The things he says, I know what he says." She kept her voice level. "I've been preparing for this conversation since I was 8 years old." She paused. "I'll be fine." He looked at her. Not assessing, not the calculating look she had spent a month cataloging, something different. "I know you will," he said. She looked back at the window. The city moved past, and the lake disappeared behind buildings, and ahead through the windshield the first gray suggestion of morning was beginning at the edge of the sky like something being slowly, reluctantly revealed. The north gate was unguarded when they arrived. That was the first wrong thing. Rafe signaled the convoy to stop 200 yards from the gate and got out and walked the perimeter while Dorian sat in the back seat with the quality of stillness that preceded action, and Serafina sat beside him and looked at the estate through the window. The long gravel drive, the facade of the main house visible at the end of it, windows lit in the ground floor, the east wing dark. Rafe came back in 3 minutes. "The guard station is empty," he said through the window, low. "Vehicles still on site. No sign of flight." He paused. "The front door is open." Dorian looked at Serafina. She looked at the open door of the house she had grown up in. "He's not running," she said. "I told you. He could be drawing us in. He is drawing us in." She met Dorian's eyes. "He wants an audience for whatever he's decided to do. He always needed an audience." She paused. "Don't let it stop you." Dorian looked at her for one more second. Then he opened the car door. They went in through the north gate in 2 groups, Dorian and Serafina with 4 men, Rafe with 3 more coming through the service entrance on the west side. The gravel crunched under their feet in the cold pre-dawn silence, and the house grew in front of them as they approached, its lit windows watching like eyes. Serafina had walked this drive 1,000 times in her life, returning from school, from the controlled social appearances her father required, from medical appointments at the private clinic where a man with a retirement and a signed agreement had written accidental on her file and moved on. She had always walked it braced. She walked it now differently. Braced still because she was not pretending this was safe, but differently. Not towards something she was trying to survive, towards something she had decided. The front door opened into the main hall. Marble floors, dark wood paneling, a staircase that curved up to the second floor with a brass railing. Her father polished personally every Sunday because there were things, specific surfaces and objects, that he needed to control in visible ways. The hall was empty. The light from the east study was visible as a thin line under the closed door at the far end. Dorian's hand came to her arm, not restraining, just the light contact of someone communicating something without words. She looked at him. He looked at the door. She nodded. They moved toward it. Vincent Vale was sitting at his desk. He was in his chair with his jacket on and his white hair swept back and his pale gray eyes on the door when they came through it, as though he had heard them coming and arranged himself appropriately, which he had. He was 61 years old, and in this room with its dark paneling and its shelves of curated books and its single lamp burning amber on the desk, he looked, as he had always looked in this room, like a man who controlled the dimensions of the space around him. He looked at the men who entered first, and then at Dorian, and then, last and longest, at Serafina. "There she is," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it. "There's the ruin." She walked into the room and stood 12 feet from his desk and looked at her father with the specific steadiness that had cost her decades to acquire, and said nothing. "Sit down, Serafina," he said. "I'd rather stand." Something moved across his face, brief, immediately suppressed. She had said those same 4 words to him once before, at 15, and he had responded in a way that had left a bruise along her jaw for 2 weeks. The memory of it moved through her body, a sensation before she could decide whether to let it. A physical echo that she breathed through and kept upright through, and then it passed, and she was still standing, and she was still looking at him. "This is quite a production," Vale said, looking at Dorian with the cool assessment of a man trying to establish terms. "I expected federal agents, not private theater." "The federal agents are behind us by about 5 hours, Dorian said. He walked to stand beside Serafina, not in front of her, beside her, and looked at Vincent Vale with the expression he'd had in the car. That below strategy thing, that absolute and unnameable thing that was older than anger. "We came first because we had things to say. Did you?" Vale looked at him. "I've heard you've had quite the change of heart. The man who is going to use my daughter as a personal instrument of revenge is now her protector." A pause, cold and precise. "It's almost touching." "Don't," Serafina said. Vale looked at her. "Don't use it," she said. "What he did. Don't try to make it a weapon against him in front of me, because I know exactly what he did, and I know what came after, and I'm standing here, which tells you something about how I've weighed it." She paused. Her voice was level, without heat, which she knew from long experience landed harder than heat ever did. "You have no position to discuss other people's failures toward me." He looked at her for a long moment. The pale gray eyes, that had been her primary source of information about danger for 25 years, did the thing they did when he was recalibrating. A slight narrowing, a fractional shift in focus, as though she had changed shape and he was revising the dimensions. "You've become quite articulate," he said. "Living with the Morettis agrees with you." "I've always been articulate," she said. "You just weren't listening." He picked up the glass on his desk, whiskey, she noted, which he only drank when he was genuinely pressured, and looked at it and set it back down without drinking. "Whatever you think you have on me," he said, "you should understand that evidence collected through a criminal organization's investigative apparatus will not survive a serious defense challenge. You should understand that the witnesses you believe you have are people with their own significant legal exposure. And you should understand," he looked at her directly, "that a daughter's testimony against her father carries the precise weight the defense team will spend 6 months assigning to it." "You're right about all of that," she said. He paused. "Partially right," she said. "You're right that the evidence has vulnerabilities. You're right that some witnesses have exposure. You're right that my testimony will be challenged." She held his gaze. "What you're not accounting for is that we have enough. Not clean, not uncontested, not easy. Enough. And enough, in this case, means that the next year of your life is spent in rooms you don't control, talking to lawyers you don't own, while everything you built comes apart in public." She paused. "Which is not the worst part." He looked at her. "The worst part," she said, "is that everyone will know. The senators, the judges, the philanthropists who put their names on buildings with yours. They'll know. And they'll spend whatever's left of their political capital making sure they're not standing anywhere near you when you go down, which means you'll go down alone." She paused one more time, and she let the last piece land quietly and precisely the way she had been rehearsing it in the back of her mind for 25 years without knowing that was what she was doing. "Just like you left me." The room was completely silent. Vincent Vale looked at his daughter across the desk, and for the first time in her memory, across the entirety of her memory of this man, she saw something shift in his face that was not recalculation and was not suppressed contempt. She couldn't name it. She didn't need to name it. She needed only to register that it was there, and that it was involuntary, and that it cost him something, and that this, the costing him something, was the only form of what she needed from him that she had ever had any hope of actually receiving. She was done waiting for the other form. "I'm going to tell you one thing," she said, "and then I'm going to walk out of this room and I won't come back." She held his gaze with absolute steadiness. "Whatever you needed to do, whatever damage had to be managed, whatever shame had to be contained, I was a child. I was your child. And there is no version of what you tell yourself at night that makes what you did to me survivable by any measure that actually matters." She breathed. "I'm not asking you to understand that. I'm telling you I know it. I have known it since I was 8 years old. And it took me 25 years and every resource I had and a man I married as a punishment to get to a room where I could say it to your face." Mo yite poton chakim shi. She paused. "So I said it." Vale's jaw moved. "Once." "Are you finished?" he said. His voice had something in it that his voice had never had in her memory. A roughness at the back of it, barely audible, instantly controlled. "Yes," she said. "I'm finished." She turned and walked toward the door. She heard him stand behind her. She heard Dorian move simultaneously, a sharp, immediate shift in position. And then she heard her father's voice, cracked now through its control, cracked in a way she had not heard in 25 years. Not since the night before her mother's birthday, when he had drunk through a bottle of something and come to the door of her room and stood in it for a long time saying nothing. And she had been 11 years old and had understood even then that whatever was happening behind his eyes was something she would never be permitted to reach. "Everything I had," he said. Her name, not Serafina, but something older, the syllable he had used when she was very small and the world had not yet required him to manage her. It came out once from somewhere beneath everything. "Everything I could not—" He stopped. She stopped at the door. She didn't turn around. She stood in the doorway of her father's study with her hand on the frame and felt the weight of the incomplete sentence land on her back and move through her in the way that things move through you when they are real and you cannot pretend they are not. A specific bruising quality, grief and rage compressed so long they had become almost indistinguishable from each other, pressing through her chest with the force of something that had been contained too long. She did not turn around, because what came after that incomplete sentence did not undo anything, could not undo anything. And she had learned long ago that the things which could not be undone had to be carried, and that the only difference between surviving them and not was whether you let them be the last word. She was not going to let them be the last word. "Goodbye, Father," she said. She walked out. Us. The sound came 60 seconds later. She was in the main hall, halfway to the front door, when the single shot echoed through the east study and died against the marble and the wood paneling and the brass railing that had been polished every Sunday, and then fell into the particular quality of silence that follows irreversible things. She stopped, stood very still in the middle of the hall where she had walked 1,000 times. Rafe appeared at the end of the hall from the west passage. He looked at her, then at the closed study door, then back at her. "Stay there," he said, and moved past her. She stood in the hall and looked at the front door, open still, the cold November air coming through it carrying the first suggestion of snow on its edge, fine and tentative, the beginning of something. She looked at the staircase with its brass railing. She looked at the marble floor, pale and cold under the hall lights. She had been standing on this floor since she was small enough that the cold of it came through her socks. She had crossed it running, and crossed it carefully, and crossed it bleeding, and crossed it so slowly that each step was a negotiation. She had looked up at the ceiling of this hall from the floor when she couldn't stand, and she had stood under the weight of this hall when standing was all she had. She stood in it now and waited. Dorian came out of the study. He crossed the hall to her and stood in front of her and looked at her face with the new quality of attention, the one that had replaced calculation. And she looked at his face and found in it the same thing she always found in it now, the truth of whatever was happening, without the management layer. "It's over," he said. She looked at him. "He used the same weapon he'd kept in that desk for 20 years, Dorian said, quiet and direct. "It was his choice. He made it before we arrived." He paused. "I want you to know it was his choice." She breathed. "I know," she said, She looked past him at the closed study door. On the other side of it, Vincent Vale had made the only decision in his life that no money and no influence and no management could revise. She held this fact and turned it over the way you turn over something heavy to see if it has another side. What she found was not what she had expected. Not relief, which she had told herself for years would be what she felt, and not grief in any simple sense, because grief required a loss, and loss required the prior existence of something to lose, and the man in that room had spent her entire childhood systematically destroying the version of him she might have grieved. What she found was something quieter and more complicated and more honest than either, the specific weight of a wound that had just stopped actively bleeding, not healed, not closed, but no longer bleeding. She could work with that. She had been working with worse her entire life. "Can we leave?" she said. "Yes," Dorian said. They walked out of the house together into the cold. Snow was falling by the time the federal team arrived. She sat in the car on the drive and watched the flakes come down in the headlights, and gave her statement to the liaison in the back seat, with the doors closed and the heat running, and Dorian standing outside the car in the snow because she had asked him to give her the space to do this alone. And he had immediately said yes and walked away, which was exactly the right response, and she noted it with the part of her that kept notes on everything. The statement took 40 minutes. She was precise and thorough and answered every question directly, and when it was done, and the liaison had stepped out, she sat alone in the car for 5 minutes and looked at the Vale estate through the windshield. The lit windows, the federal vehicles in the drive, the snow coming down soft and indifferent over all of it, and she said goodbye to it in the interior way that was her own, without ceremony, without the need for anyone to witness it. Then she opened the car door and stepped out into the cold. Dorian was standing 20 feet away near the edge of the drive, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the snow. He heard her and turned, and they looked at each other across the 20 feet with the snow between them falling soft and quiet. She walked to him. They stood together in the cold and looked at nothing in particular for a while. "What happens now?" she said. "Legally. Months. Probably a year. Depositions, proceedings, the financial case." He paused. "Castellano will cooperate. He has no reason not to now that Vale is gone. The political relationships will unravel fairly quickly once the protection is removed. And Enzo." He was quiet for a moment. "His daughter has been removed from the Wicker Park property. She's safe." He paused. "Enzo's situation is, I haven't decided. He has 14 years of loyalty and 2 years of betrayal, and both of those are real, and I haven't decided how that weighs." He looked at the snow. "He knew things about my brother's death that he didn't tell me because he believed I would go off and destroy myself with it if I knew too early. He was probably right." A pause. "That doesn't make it better, but it doesn't make it simple either." "No," she said. "Nothing is." He glanced at her. "Is that something you're going to hold on to? The not simple?" "I've been holding on to not simple my entire life," she said. "I'm very good at it." A sound that was almost a sound came from him. Not quite a laugh, something shorter and involuntary, something she hadn't heard from him before. She looked at him. He looked at her. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "What?" He looked at the snow. His jaw was not rigid for once. It was just his face, without the armor it usually wore, without the management layer. "Whatever this is, what's on the other side of all of this?" He paused. "I've known how to want things, and how to build toward them, and how to take them apart when they're finished. I don't know the architecture of what comes after." She looked at his profile. The man who had told her she breathed when he allowed it, and had knocked twice with 2 knuckles and handed her a blanket, and had sent for Marta in Evanston, and had stood beside her and not in front of her, and had said stay and meant please. "Neither do I," she said. He looked at her. "I've only ever survived," she said. I don't know what living looks like. Not practically. Not from the inside." She held his gaze. "I know it looks like doing the next thing. That's all I've ever known. Do the next thing and stay upright and see what comes after." She paused. "So that's what I'll do." "And the next thing," he said. "Tonight? Get warm. Sleep somewhere I feel safe." She looked at the snow coming down. "Tomorrow is another calculation." He was quiet for a moment. "You feel safe at the manor," he said. It was not quite a question. She thought about the library and the flowers and the blanket and Marta and two knocks with two knuckles at 2 in the morning and the enormous bed in the room with the windows facing the lake and the particular quality of that house's silence which had changed somewhere across 35 days from threatening to something that was still unfamiliar but was not quite, hostile. "Yes," she said. The word landed quietly between them in the snow. They were back at Blackthorn Manor by 9 in the morning. The lake was visible from the front drive as they pulled through the gate, flat and steel gray under a low sky, the snow having eased to a fine mist that made everything at a distance slightly uncertain. Hilda met them at the door with 2 cups of coffee and the specific expression of a woman who had spent decades in a house that dealt in difficult things and had learned to express concern through hot beverages and no direct questions. Serafina took the coffee and looked at the manor, at the 4 stories of dark stone and the windows she knew from the inside now, from the library and the covered terrace and the hallway outside her room and the kitchen table where she had eaten 7 bites of food on the worst night and 3 more bites because someone with pale eyes and no warmth had told her to, and it had been the first time in a long time that someone had noticed whether she ate. She went inside. The weeks that followed had the texture of something new being broken in, not comfortable yet, not settled, but no longer actively resistant. The legal proceedings moved at the pace such things moved, which was slow and grinding and occasionally required her presence in offices and conference rooms where she sat and answered questions and provided context, and watched Vincent Vale's carefully constructed world come apart at its load-bearing points, with the particular satisfaction of someone who had been one of those points for 25 years. Marta arrived at Blackthorn Manor on a Wednesday. She was 62 now, heavier than Serafina remembered, with gray in her hair and the same dark, steady eyes that had looked through a gap under a door and decided that leaving food there was the only thing she could do, and so she would do it well. She cried when she saw Serafina, not with the performing grief of someone making a display, with the specific, involuntary release of a person who has carried something they couldn't put down for a long time and have finally been given a surface to set it on. Serafina held her. She had not initiated physical contact with another person in she could not calculate how long. She held Marta in the front hall of Blackthorn Manor and felt the unfamiliar weight of another person's warmth and stayed very still inside it, the way you stay still inside something you don't want to break. Dorian, passing through the hall toward his study, stopped for a moment in the doorway and looked at the 2 of them. Then he went on without speaking. Serafina registered this, the specific quality of looking and going on, of not making it a thing that required management. It was a small thing. She had learned that small things were where the actual information was. She filed it. The east wing of Blackthorn Manor underwent a renovation beginning in January. It was her idea. She brought it to Dorian across the kitchen table on an evening when the snow was thick outside and the lake was invisible behind it, and she laid out what she was thinking, carefully, in the same way she had laid out everything in this house, not requesting permission but presenting a proposition. And he read the paper she had prepared and looked at it for a moment and said, "You'll need a director, someone with clinical credentials and experience with trauma-specific care." "I know, I have a name." He looked up. "She's in Milwaukee," Serafina said. "She ran a program there for 4 years. The program lost its funding in 2022. She's been in private practice since." She paused. "I've done the research." He looked at her across the kitchen table, that new quality of attention, the one that had been building since the bathroom floor and had never entirely receded. "Of course you have," he said. The renovation took 3 months. The wing that emerged was not dramatically different from the outside. Dorian's insistence for security reasons, and she had agreed without argument because she understood the logic. But inside, the rooms had been remade entirely, warm and private, and without the institutional quality that announced itself as a place of distress. 4 rooms for residents, a common space with actual thought put into it, the kind of thought that said, "We want you to feel like a person here, not a case." An office for the director. A small garden entrance that had its own path to the outside, its own gate, its own key, so that the women who came here would have a door they could open themselves. The day the first resident arrived, a 27-year-old woman from the south side whose legal name had been changed twice in the past year, and who arrived at the gate with one bag and the specific stillness of a person who has been afraid for so long they've forgotten it's not their natural state. Serafina was the one who opened the door. She brought her inside, showed her the room, left water and food, the same way Marta had left food, without comment, without the weight of obligation. She sat with her in the common space for 20 minutes and answered the practical questions and let the others be unasked, because she knew from long experience that the others would come when the woman was ready and not before. Before she left, the woman looked at her and said, "How long does it take to feel not like this?" Serafina looked at her, thought about the bathroom floor and the blanket and the arithmetic and the 35 days and the 72 hours, and the morning in a dead man's hall with snow coming through an open door. "I'll tell you honestly," she said, "I don't know yet. I'm still finding out." She paused. "But it happens. That I can tell you with certainty. It happens." The woman looked at her hands. "Okay," she said very quietly. "Okay," Serafina said. Boss. In late February, when the worst of winter had eased to something merely cold rather than hostile, she was standing at the edge of the lake behind the manor as the light came down long and pale through the leafless oaks. She heard him before she saw him. The particular quality of his footsteps, which she had catalogued in the first weeks here as threatening, and had recatalogued slowly across the months into something that was simply his, and she didn't turn around because she didn't need to. He came to stand beside her. They looked at the lake together in the February light. "The proceedings," he said. Stern called. "April timeline for the first major hearing." She paused. "He's confident." "He should be. We have everything." "We have enough," she said, the same correction she had made to her father across a desk in a lit room 4 months ago, and she felt him register it beside her. A small shift, the knowledge of what she was echoing and why. Silence. The lake moved in the cold air with its flat gray persistence, the way it had moved every day she had been in this house, indifferent to everything happening on its shore. "You know," she said, "you were supposed to ruin my life." She felt him turn to look at her. "I know," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with his whole face, no management layer, no calculation, just the thing itself, whatever it was. The complicated and unresolved and very human thing that had been building across 4 months and 2 cities and 1 phone call and a piece of paper with 25 years of memory on it. There were tears in her eyes. Not from fear. She noted this with the part of her that noted everything, registered it as new data, filed it in the place where things were kept that mattered. Not from grief, from something that didn't have a name yet, but felt, in its earliest and most tentative form, like the first day after a very long winter. "But you gave me one instead," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not urgently, not with the weight of a gesture trying to mean too much. Just the simple contact of one hand finding another in the cold. The way you reach for something you're not sure you're allowed to have and then carefully allow yourself. She looked at their hands, then at the lake, then back at him. His thumb moved once across her knuckles. A small thing, barely perceptible. The kind of small thing that was, in her experience, where the actual information always lived. She didn't pull away. They stood at the edge of the frozen water in the February light. 2 people who had arrived in each other's lives as instruments of damage and had become, through the slow and costly and unplanned work of being honest in close proximity, something neither of them had been before. Not fixed, not healed, not standing anywhere that was without its history or its cost. But standing, together. While the lake lay quiet before them and the pale light moved through the oaks and the city flickered in the far distance and the long winter began, finally, incrementally, without announcement, to turn